Welcome to the Ferris Love Podcast. Here we explore spiritual insights and practical strategies to help you cultivate a family life rooted in beautiful, self-giving love. Join us as we invite experts to share uplifting perspectives and actionable advice for navigating the joys and challenges of modern family dynamics. Welcome back to the Ferris Love Podcast. I'm your host, Mary Grace Warner, and today on the show, we have Rachel Balducci, writer, speaker, mother of 6, who brings honesty and deep insight into the everyday realities of family life. She is the author of several books, including Make My Life Simple, and she shares practical wisdom on creating a home filled with peace and joy. Rachel encourages parents to embrace simplicity and let go of perfectionism, and then also to rediscover beauty in those ordinary moments. So I'm really excited to have you on the show, Rachel, and we're excited to discuss kind of simple living and how that makes stronger families. So Rachel, thank you so much for being on our show.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here, Mary Grace. Thank you for the invitation.
So you have 6 kids, you have read 5 sons and 1
Yes.
daughter. That's a crazy life right there.
Yes, yeah.
Would you share a little bit about your family life and kind of what brought you to writing those books that you have and kind of what you're doing with your mission?
Yeah, sure. It's so fun to get to share about this. So my kids are getting older now. Our daughter is the youngest of our 6, and she is 15. So yeah. So I've got a 15-year-old and then an 18-year-old. Our son Henry is a senior in high school. And then we call them the big boys there because we had like a 6-year gap between the first 4, and they're all in their 20s now. So they all live in the neighborhood. 2 of them are roommates, like 2 doors up from us. One lives here at home before he heads to law school next year. And then the oldest of our sons lives right down the street. So it's beautiful. We're kind of like all right here in this season. And so there's still a lot of coming and going in the home. But I'm so glad that you asked about like, how did I get started writing about this? So I'll kind of go back several years when right after our 4th son was born, and those 4 boys were all within 5 years. So every 21 months, we added a new boy to the mix. It was really crazy. Yeah. And so I had been a newspaper reporter before I, stopped to stay home with our oldest son. And I just was really missing writing. And also motherhood was not what I thought it was going to be like. With this many boys, like I really just had this vision of really like a calm, like peace-filled home. And I had all these sons that were constantly like sword fighting, lightsaber fighting, like dressing up all the time. And I was like, I need like a mental outlet for this life that the Lord has given me that I'm struggling to see as a gift right now, honestly, Mm-hmm. So I started a blog, which back then was kind of like a little revolutionary. Now blogs are kind of like gone again. And now I think they're coming back. But so I started this blog, and it was called Testosterone. And I wrote about being a mom of a bunch of boys, and it resonated with lots of people. And it was so wonderful because a lot of other women were in the same boat as me. And so I enjoyed kind of connecting with those women. And so the way the book came about was I ended up getting to take those stories and put them in book form with, a lot of new content. And that was back. I mean, it's so funny. By then we had added a 5th son to the mix. And so my first book is called How Do You Tuck in a Superhero? And it's not really advice at all. Like I was writing from the trenches of motherhood. And it was kind of like, really, I kind of had started to ask myself, I can get up every day and I can either laugh or I can cry. And I would rather laugh. And I ended up mostly doing both, as all moms know. There's a lot of both going on. And that book came out actually April 1st, and our daughter, many years ago, and our daughter was born a week later. She was born on April 7th. So it was so funny that right as that book was coming out, we added a girl to the mix. And so I found, like writing about motherhood helped me kind of take a step back and really appreciate the gift of what I would say the chaos of it. And I love that we're here to talk about peace in our homes today, because that ended up being like my next book, but not for several years. And it was because, the reality of life with kids, no matter how many you have, is there is a level of frenzy that goes along with it. And I had gotten to this place where I was like, okay, what is a given in this scenario? What are things that I can't change? And then what can I change? And what can I control, so to speak? What decisions can I make to bring peace into my own life, into our family life? And that's kind of what brought me to that next book. So that's my story of like how I started writing about motherhood And really, then that over the years, like once my big boys became teenagers, I really stopped blogging because so much of what was happening was not stuff that I could write about, unfortunately. And I learned so much in those years, but not anything I could write my way through, so to speak, you know? So that's kind of my story of how I got started with the writing
Yeah.
about motherhood.
That's great. Yeah. And I'm sure you've experienced just like, yeah, the ins and outs of motherhood and parenting and all that stuff. And then, like you mentioned, the kind of crazier, more intense, probably side of parenting
Mm.
as your children got a little older. And so I just am wondering how you became drawn to this idea of, yeah, simple living as a path to joy. So I know you've got this book, and just, yeah, what I'm sure that the idea of having five sons and one daughter probably is where you'd like to find those simple living, but just curious
Yeah.
at your thoughts on that.
Sure. So, really, what happened is I was going through this phase in life where by then our youngest child, our daughter, had started kindergarten, and I started working at the school that my kids all went to. They have gone to a K through 12 private Christian school. That's a big part of our life. And I was like, what kind of stay at home mom? By then, I was doing a lot of freelance writing and speaking by then. And I was the columnist for our diocesan newspaper. So that started kind of opening doors for me to do some more kind of outreach stuff. But I found myself wanting to do more. And it really was coming from this place of insecurity. Like, I didn't realize that. Like, I wanted to use the gifts God had given me, and I wanted to do something fun during the day. And none of the kids were home. So, I asked myself, what kind of stay at home mom is home with no kids? And I should have just been like, wait and listen for an answer. But instead, I was like, we got to be doing stuff. And so what happened is I really got to this place where I was taking on so many things and staying so busy that the fruit in our home life was we were all feeling stretched thin. Because I mean, it really is that, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, that saying. And I feel like if the mom is stressed and not at peace, that's kind of the vibe that it brings to the home. And it was kind of like the Holy Spirit started just showing me some things. Like I had this real desire for peace, but what I was doing was I made decisions based on kind of what I thought other people, I would look around and see, well, what other people were doing and could I do that? Or that looked, like I could teach that class, I could volunteer this much time. And I wasn't paying attention to like what was going on in our home. And like most importantly, what does the Lord want me to do in this season of our family life? And I think that is like, as we talk more in this conversation, that's always kind of the center of the target. And I think a big thing that started to shift for me, Mary Grace, was like I really was feeling drawn to more prayer in my life. As the kids got bigger, I found myself, it was not a me thing. It was like I felt like the Lord was drawing me into prayer. And the more time I spent in prayer, the more awareness I had of, like kind of interior feelings of like, I'm not at peace. I'm at, feeling disrupted a lot of the time. And so that was an interesting kind of moment where I realized there is this goal of peace and I want it and we're not there right now.
Yeah. Well, and I think what you said probably resonates with a lot of our audience because you were talking about all the things that you were doing during the day when your kids were at school and just it became overwhelming. And also that comparison idea of, moms and dads probably too suffer from that like idea of, oh, what's Susie doing down the street? Or, should I be doing that with our children or things like that? So that can definitely contribute to kind of a lack of peace in the home.
Yes.
When you think of a peaceful home, do you have anything that comes to mind based on your own family life and just what routines or things did you set up that actually helped provide that peace? You said prayer. You mentioned prayer was a big aspect of it, but if is there anything else?
Yeah. So a couple of key things, like I think what really matters for me is I had to get to this place where I stopped comparing what other people were doing. And I have like this funny story. I don't know if I ever wrote about it, but I think I did in one of my books. Where as I was getting more into like contemplative prayer, and when the kids were at school, I was able to start spending a little bit of time in the adoration chapel here and there. And I was like, okay, the adoration chapel is so peaceful. Everybody needs this level of peace. Like we need this peace in our home. And so one night during family prayers, which have been very important in our family life, I decided that family prayers were going to look like me lighting a bunch of candles and us kneeling in the front room in quiet reflection, But I mean, at this point, I had five sons, probably between the ages of 6 and 16, and then a little toddler daughter. And I lit a bunch of candles and then expected everybody to just like kneel there. It's like crazy. And so all of a sudden, it's like, one boy starts leaning forward and trying to stick his fingers in the flame. And I'm looking at my husband like, what is wrong with our family? And he's being so patient, but he's like, Rach, like, this is not an ideal situation for us. And so that was like a funny memory, but like such an important moment for me to realize peace really comes from being where God has you. And so I was trying to make our family something that it was not. And I needed to be like, okay, who are the members of my family? What are our temperaments? And I don't even mean like getting into the love language. Literally, if you have a bunch of boys of a certain age, it's not that they're crazy and uncontrollable, but probably certain things are going to work better for that family makeup than others. So that was a big game changer, I think, for me, was getting to this point where I learned to be just comfortable in my own skin. Okay. So that would be the best and most practical advice I could give to any moms out there listening, is like, there's not one right way to do any of this. Like, we are now in a season where we say the rosary as a family in the evenings, and we go through seasons where we're doing great, and then we'll kind of fall off, and the fruit in our life is so good when we do that. And then we'll forget, and then we're like, hey, we need to get back in this habit again. That was not something that was realistic for us when our kids were smaller. Some families are able to do that, and that's great. But if there's a mom out there and they feels like she's failing because she's not doing the Angelus, or she sees this other family that's able to pull off daily mass or taking the kids to adoration, it's like, you have to be who God made you to be and be in the season that God has you. I have another memory of we go to this big historic church in the downtown of our city, and it's just this gorgeous marble everywhere. And they had adoration one day, and I brought the six kids, and we quietly walked to the very front and sat in the front pew. And I think that I had just had enough time to set the baby carrier down and to kneel before a fight broke out with two of the boys at the end. And I had to or somebody pushed somebody, or somebody was too loud. And I just I literally sat down, and then I stood back up, and I just our sounds were echoing off of every surface in that church. And I'm like, I'm not doing this to myself, and another mom might be like, no, we're going to do it. It doesn't matter. And that's great too. But I feel like you really find peace when you're really paying attention to the season you're in, who God created your family to be. There's only one Balducci family, and that's beautiful. I'm not trying to keep up with anybody else. And there's a lot of freedom and peace that comes when you start to operate out of that truth. I will say, and I love how full circle this is, because it always comes back to prayer. And we really only know our identity, and we can really only be at peace with who God made us to be when we're spending that time with God, hearing Him speak truth to us about ourselves. And that's really when I started to be free to say no to stuff and to say yes to things, is because I started to have a sense of what I do does not define my worth as a mom or as a woman, or, what my family does doesn't define our worth. And I think we are so quick to get caught up in doing activities. When our oldest son was 4, I signed him up for soccer, and I was pregnant with my 4th child at that point, and chasing a toddler. And I was so worried that if he didn't play sports young, he wasn't gonna make the high school team. We spent that season, I chased a small child. We were, barely, I'm waddling around the soccer field. I didn't see any of the games. And the next season, my husband was like, we could take a few years off. Ethan will not be left in the dust. And sure enough, it worked out,
Yeah.
So it's just kind of being comfortable with not always doing what everybody else is doing, but doing what works best for your family.
Yeah, those are beautiful words. And I am curious your thoughts, because it's easy. Well, it's not easy, obviously, to say, as a parent, to say, okay, we're not doing this, we're doing this, the comparison model. What do you say about the children? Because you have older children now. What do you say about them who, maybe want to do these things, or think that because they're comparing themselves to their friends or things like that? What do you tell your children to encourage your own family, your own family dynamic and your own family personality, while
Yeah.
also not falling into that game of comparison with your kids falling into that?
Yeah, I think that, it's great to be open to trying things. And I think that's a beautiful, aspect of family life is like, I think when we were a young family, I have this memory of going out to dinner with some friends who had gotten married at the same time as us. And we had four kids at that point, and by then I think they had eight, like they were like, and they homeschooled and they lived on property, and it was like everything people dream to do. And I went out there with this purpose of like, getting her to tell me all her secrets. How do you decide what activities your kids are going to do? And how do you decide this? And she's like, I don't know. She's like, we're shooting from the hip, and that is the secret in family life is I think sometimes it's easy to think that there are people, and maybe there are people out there who operate this way, but it's not really about having this form that you refer to make decisions. Like sometimes it is like, and I love that the focus of this podcast today is peace, because that is, my dad would always say, like, peace is the umpire of the game. Like if that's our goal and that's what we're asking the Lord to provide for us, we're gonna find ways to get that. But for us, what we had to learn to do was like each time something came up, we would evaluate it. So then we didn't have some hard, fast rule. We always do this. We never do this, in general. But then if an opportunity came up, we would evaluate that. Is this something we can afford with our time? Is it something we can afford with our money? And being willing to kind of ask that, and then in different seasons, like our none of our big boys did year-round sports. It worked out that we had lots of opportunities for music and sports and other things within our school. But I say they never did. And then one of them all of a sudden did. And it was a season where a group of his friends ended up being on this basketball team. And it worked out because another parent was the coach, and we didn't have to drive them places. And, so that wasn't something we necessarily could have done on our own. But it's like, oh, this is an opportunity that will work for us, and that was great. Fast forward, and now like our daughter Isabel has done a couple of rounds of like travel volleyball. I don't think I would have ever been able to do that with one of the older kids, because it required kind of like being gone every other weekend for a few months. And then we tried it, and then we were like, this isn't a good fit for us.
Yeah.
But we gave it a shot, and then it was like, okay, we didn't say no just reflexively, but we did say yes. And then she was like, I don't like volleyball this much, So kind of, I think just being willing to really evaluate, like, ultimately what matters most, is if peace is what you're going for, then you have a sense of what that feels like. And then you're kind of like, okay, what can I add? And then if I add something, do I need to take something else away? And just kind of figuring out. I do know some families who are like, their rule in the family is every kid gets one sport a season. Like they're not doing multiple sports, for example, and that sounds great too. Like there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. And again, each family, I would just, again, encourage parents out there, like, just don't make decisions out of fear. Like, don't make decisions because you're afraid that that kid won't have this opportunity down the road. Like the Lord really can work all of these things out. If it's like your kid has this great ability, you have the money for them to do this, you have the time, it's a great bonding time for y'all. That's wonderful. But to look around and be like, oh no, everybody else is doing this. My kid doesn't even like the sport. We can't afford it. Yeah. Use circumstances to kind of point you towards what makes the most sense in this situation.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the lack of peace from the home comes from like all the activities and things like that. But have you ever had times where your children will come to you like sad, or where it's affected your whole family? And like, how has either your spiritual life or how has just what you believe to be like the strengths of your family helped in combating that lack of peace and then bringing it back to joy?
Sure. So I'll tell you a story that relates more a season as my children started to get older, but I think it can still be relatable, like when you do have smaller kids too, which is like our oldest son went off to college, and it was not a good situation for him, and he ended up coming home, and it was one of those, like, he left one way and he came back a different way, and he decided not to go back after the first two semesters. And he could have gone back, he didn't flunk out or anything, but he said, I don't like who I've become. I don't, and he came home. That was devastating for me, because like my pride was, I really felt like when he went off to college, he got into his dream school. He got into my dream school for him, And so, I think as moms, we can relate to this in any different season of like what seems to be like something moving very perfectly ends up kind of falling apart. And the growth that happened in that season of, how much of our identity is tied up in how well our kids are doing. And then when you kind of have to let that go and walk along beside a child who is starting to experience free will and then the fruit of free will, and really like what I learned in that season was just kind of like the Lord walks beside us even when we're going through hard stuff. And I think I had this false sense of like, God's favor shines upon you when your kids are all making good decisions, And I think I even had a false sense that I didn't even know that I really had that core belief because, with 5 boys, they were always wild. It's not like, we would ever get like report cards that were like, this is the quietest, most well-behaved child in the class, like we're kind of all out there, so there was a level of this that I was used to, like kind of, we're working to have good standards for ourselves, but always like, we're working hard and we're experiencing growth. And then to kind of all of a sudden feel like all these years of moving in one direction and then just to hit this wall was pretty devastating. This whole idea of free will and how what a pain in the absolute butt it is.
Yeah, yeah.
It's really not that fun until you kind of get to the other side and you're like, all right, Lord, like these children are not extensions of me. They are their own self, and that's a real gift, but it's a painful time of growth. And I think in certain seasons when they're little, we experience that in small ways. And then as they get older, we experience it in bigger ways. For me personally, what the Lord did, so there was like what was going on within our family, was like, and really even the sadness of the oldest child leaving. That felt like a death in the family to me because we had all been here together in the big old family van, coming and going together, and then he goes off to college, and that was really painful and sad. And then the shift in, like, I really thought 18 high school was like, check, we did it. We gave all the parenting wisdom. We gave them gave him everything he needed. And now it's up to him. And it's like, oh, wow, no, the journey has just begun.
Yeah.
Like a different kind of parenting, So in the midst of that, it was like really turning to the Lord for peace, like my peace doesn't come from the externals of how well my kids are doing. And I think I was falsely, even when he came back, I was like, okay, we're going to get this sorted out, and I'm like, oh, I'm living in some space where I think I can only be at peace. I'm only as at peace as my least peaceful child, and that's not reality. There's a part of that that's true. Like a mother's heart hurts when her child is hurting, for sure. But we can't feel like I felt like I was living like I can just be kind of holding on like this until things get sorted out. And it's like, that's not real life, So we spend that time in prayer. We seek the Lord's voice. I mean, it's like it all comes back to prayer very consistently.
Yeah. Did you get anything from this podcast?
Yeah, just that's your takeaway from Rachel.
Yeah. No, 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 no. That's great. And I love how you mentioned just like the will of your own children. I think just even returning back to your prayer and finding the peace and knowing like kind of it's not in your control. Like your son and his everything's like that. That's what struck me about that.
Yeah, and Mary Grace, let me add something in the midst of this too, because ultimately nothing's in our control. But then I also like to the point of what you're asking, like what are some practical things? Because there is a lot as parents. Like it's certainly not that your kids get to a certain age and you're like, well, I can't control anything and I just got to pray about it. And so I do want to add a little bit about that because Paul and we realize like the kind of control that you don't have control, but you certainly have wisdom that you can share and you have relationship. And that was the big thing that we recognized in that season that continues now with each of our kids. It's like, we're not going to be able to correct them, make them ask forgiveness and do the right thing. Like that's not, when kids are little, you're like, don't touch the stove. You touched it. You got burned. Don't do it again, or you go to timeout because you got into the cookies in the pantry or something, like what it means as they get older is that relationship is so important, and you're building that, just that time with them and opportunities to speak truth without like being mad if they're not doing what you say, like we have this call to love. Like think of how the Father loves us. We mess up all the time, and he has this unconditional love, but he still finds ways to kind of remind us that you're going to be way better off doing it this way than this way, but you have free will. And there's just a lot of that as your kids get older. I like one big thing I recognized as the boys all started becoming teenagers, we hit fast food drive-throughs all the time. And you might be like, that's gross, you shouldn't be eating that. But it was such a special time in the car. And I remember my mom and dad really being intentional about that with my siblings and I, is like sitting in the car, that there's just the pressure is really off. Like you can both be like facing forward. You're not like staring deeply into each other's eyes. You're hitting a drive through, getting a milkshake or a cheeseburger, and you're just like driving, listening to music, and maybe having not any heavy conversation, or something big comes up and you have that opportunity. And so, again, to be open to the leadings of the Holy Spirit, like our son, Charlie, he had this really bad burn injury when he was in middle school. And I ended up having to take him to see a burn specialist weekly for several months. And we would always go to Sonic on the way home. And for a while I was like, oh, I don't want to, we go every week. In my mind, I'm thinking this. As soon as he made it through that season, he entered puberty and he was a bear for the next 5 years. And I was able to look back on those months as like this special time that we had. And I'm glad I didn't know, because I don't want to impart fear in any parents. There's grace to walk through all of these things. But I remember looking back when all of a sudden Charlie just sort of woke up one day and he really struggled in puberty. He being nice was just not one of his, it was not part of the deal in that season. And to think about like the groundwork that we had laid in kind of those last few months before this shift, and it's funny because now he's made it through, and oh my gosh, he's just, I would love being around him. It's so wonderful. We had about 5 years where we went nose to nose constantly, so family life is just, you're looking for those opportunities to be real with each other, to have fun, because there's lots of work going on, in family life all the time.
Right. That's true. And as we kind of round out, I love how this conversation's just been full circle the whole time, like bringing it back, just to kind of round out the conversation and kind of tie it up in a nice little bow. When you look at your family now, is there, you mentioned that story with your son too, but like, do you see the fruits? So all your sons are getting older and your daughter's getting older. She's in high school. Do you see those fruits of simple living? Like, do you see the joy, maybe what they do with their own lives and how they treat their friends? Kind of, do you see the products of your hard labor, I would say, from those earlier years?
I really do. And it's such a gift to see that, like simple living. And I hope that listeners aren't like, I thought you were going to talk about how to keep your house tidy or streamlined. And I will say very quickly, like when I wrote that book, of the 4 books I wrote, Superhero, and then Make My Life Simple. And that really was a season where I was super busy. And I felt like if you have the right system for everything, you can do all the things. And if you're in a busy season, there's a lot to be said for that. But then I realized, I can't live at this pace all the time. And so then I wrote about Overcommitted, which was, kind of like learning to say yes and no. So the practical part of simplicity is kind of probably a conversation for a different time. But I would say when we think about simplicity within our relationships, within our home, emotionally, spiritually, it really is like listening to the voice of the Lord, asking the Blessed Mother for her mantle of protection. She never lets us down in her intercession for us. And we see the fruit of it just in relationship with our kids. We've walked through hard times, but to have relationship with them where, as they have free will, we are people that they are comfortable coming to, or we've lived a life where there are relationships for them if we're not the person. Like keeping a short list of grievances was a big thing in our family life. We still do that, so that these brothers and their sister have each other when times get tough. When, one of the boys was making a bad decision several years ago, and Paul and I talked to him about it. And then a couple days later, his brother said something. And he was like, well, I mean, I know you said the same thing, but you're my parents. And we're like,
You're like,
you know,
oh,
so
okay.
yeah, like I think just my encouragement for all the families out there is just like to not forget, like, for as much as you love your kids, the Lord loves them so much more. And for as much as St. Augustine says, or John of the Cross, who is it? For as much as you are seeking the Lord, he is seeking you that much more. And so to not despair, like if you're in a season where you feel overwhelmed and you feel like you can't get on top of it, just start to ask the Lord, like, you know, give me the wisdom to start looking in the right place. Give me the wisdom to hear your voice. You know the desires of my heart, Lord, my desire for peace, my desire for happiness and joy within our family. Please guide our feet into the way of peace. And the Lord really will be faithful.
That's beautiful. And yeah, and I think it's also just another testament that it might be hard work, in the beginning, and you have to put the work in to a certain degree, like you talked about, taking your son out for fast food and talking and putting in those hours, I guess you would say, to build those relationships so that now as they're growing into being adults, like they still can trust you and they can still talk to you. And I think and they still find comfort and peace in you, probably,
Yeah.
as their parents. So that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we'd
Yeah.
love to hear about your books. And if you want to have anything else you'd like to share so that our audience can either find you on your website or anything like that, please let us know.
Yeah, sure. So I've kind of talked a little bit about the 4 different books. The one I didn't mention is the most recent, and now it's several years old. It's through Ave Maria Press, and it's No Such Thing as Ordinary. And that really is kind of like thoughts on prayer and kind of like my journey with prayer as a busy mom, and kind of like what the Lord did for me in the midst of some hard seasons and how faithful the Lord is. That's the other book. And then right now I'm working on my PhD in religion.
Oh, great.
So I'm doing a lot of writing, but none of it's really interesting to me, but it's nothing I'm putting out there yet. But I'm excited because my dissertation is going to be about what Catholic women look for when they go on retreat. So I've been kind of looking into this idea of, holiness and peace and what are these feelings that we experience, and when we get disrupted in that, family life is a great example of that, how we kind of get back to being in a space with the Lord where we're at peace. So that's really exciting. I have, rachelbalducci.com is my website. And if anybody ever, I do a lot of speaking, and you can track me down there. And I'm on Instagram at Rachel Balducci. So
Great. Perfect. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your insights into peace and joy in the midst of family life. We're so grateful to have you on the show, and we look forward to seeing what you do with your PhD and all that good stuff. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun to chat with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fairest Love podcast. In 2026, we continue to share the devotion to Mary, Mother of Fairest Love. If you like what you heard on today's show, please visit our website at fairestlovefamilyproject.org, where you can find additional podcasts and other resources for families. Be sure to also check us out on social media at Fairest Love Project. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you on an episode soon.